There is a quiet danger that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't insult others directly or fail spectacularly in public. Instead, it settles in slowly, disguising itself as confidence, experience, or being set in one's ways. The Stoics warned us about this long before modern psychology gave it a name. A closed mind is not simply the absence of new ideas. It is the refusal to question one's own certainty. And once that refusal becomes a habit, wisdom has nowhere left to grow. A closed mind is built out of fear more than ignorance. Fear of being wrong, fear of looking inexperienced, fear of discovering that what once worked no longer does. Many people confuse rigidity with strength, believing that holding the same views for years proves conviction. But Stoicism teaches the opposite. Strength is not found in clinging to old conclusions. It is found in the willingness to revise them when reason demands it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that if someone could show him he was mistaken, he would gladly change, because truth was more valuable than pride. That sentence alone dismantles the myth that intelligence is about always being right. You can often recognize a closed mind by how quickly it rejects unfamiliar ideas, not with careful examination, but with reflexive dismissal. That won't work. We've always done it this way. That's not how things are. These statements feel final, but they are actually defensive. They protect the ego from discomfort. And every time they are used, they shrink the person who speaks them, not outwardly, but internally. The world keeps changing, but their inner framework stays frozen, slowly becoming outdated. Consider how this shows up in everyday life. A manager refuses new systems because the old ones feel familiar. A parent dismisses a child's perspective because you'll understand when you're older. A professional ignores feedback because it challenges their identity as competent. In each case, the issue is not intelligence, it is attachment. Attachment to being right, attachment to past success, attachment to a version of the self that no longer fits the present moment. Stoicism sees this as a form of self-imposed blindness. When you decide in advance that you already know enough, you stop seeing clearly. What makes a closed mind especially destructive is that it rarely harms only the person who holds it. It affects everyone around them. Teams stagnate, relationships tense, opportunities pass quietly, and instead of questioning their stance, the closed-minded individual looks outward for blame. The market changed, people became lazy, standards declined. Anything except the possibility that their own thinking needed updating. This is why Stoics emphasized self-examination so heavily. Without it, the mind becomes a fortress that keeps truth out as effectively as it keeps danger away. An open mind, in contrast, is not gullible or indecisive. Stoicism does not advocate believing everything you hear. It advocates listening before judging, testing ideas against reason instead of reflex. An open mind says, "I don't know yet." It says, "Explain that again." It says, "What if I'm missing something?" These are not weak statements, they are disciplined ones. They require confidence without ego, security without arrogance. There is also humility at the core of wisdom. Not the performative humility that downplays ability, but the genuine humility that recognizes limits. The Stoics understood that knowledge is always partial, always provisional. The moment you treat your current understanding as final, you stop learning. And when learning stops, decline begins, no matter how experienced or accomplished you are. A closed mind is not a single decision. It is a pattern, one that forms slowly through unchallenged certainty. If you recognize this tendency in yourself, Stoicism does not ask you to feel ashamed. It asks you to become alert. Awareness is the beginning of change. Start by noticing resistance. Notice when an idea irritates you before you've examined it. Notice when disagreement feels like a threat instead of an invitation to think more clearly. Those moments are opportunities. Each one is a chance to loosen the grip of ego and strengthen the grip of reason. Wisdom does not require you to abandon your beliefs. It requires you to hold them lightly enough that truth can still reach you. The Stoic goal is not to win arguments or preserve comfort. It is to live in alignment with reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. And reality does not reward closed minds. It bypasses them. In the next part, we will look at another habit that keeps people trapped in the same cycles for years, the refusal to take responsibility, and why blaming others feels relieving in the moment but quietly destroys character over time. There is a habit that feels comforting at first, even protective, but over time it quietly erodes character. It is the habit of blaming. When something goes wrong, when progress stalls, when life refuses to cooperate, the mind reaches outward and assigns fault. The economy, the system, other people, bad timing, bad luck. Blame offers immediate relief because it removes responsibility, and in doing so, it removes power. The Stoics understood this clearly. The moment you give away responsibility, you give away the ability to change anything. Blame is seductive because it feels logical. After all, many things truly are outside our control. Other people do act unfairly. Circumstances do interfere. Systems are flawed. Stoicism does not deny this. What it denies is the usefulness of dwelling there. Epictetus taught that while external events are not up to us, our judgments about them always are. Blame is a judgment that says, "There is nothing meaningful I could have done." And once that judgment settles in, growth stops. You can recognize the blame habit by how quickly explanations appear after failure. The project failed because the team wasn't good enough. The relationship ended because the other person changed. The opportunity was missed because someone else didn't notice your value. These explanations may contain partial truth, but they are incomplete. And incompleteness is where stagnation lives. Intelligent people do not ask, "Whose fault is this?" They ask, "What part of this belongs to me?" That question is uncomfortable. It demands honesty. But it is also the only question that leads somewhere new. Blame also distorts self-perception. When nothing is ever your fault, nothing is ever truly yours. Not the failures, but not the successes either. You become dependent on circumstances aligning perfectly. Your confidence becomes fragile because it relies on external validation. Stoicism aims for the opposite. It seeks an internal locus of control where dignity comes from effort and judgment, not outcome. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the obstacle is the way, meaning that difficulty itself is the training ground for character. Blame turns obstacles into excuses. Responsibility turns them into lessons. There is another cost to blaming that often goes unnoticed. It damages trust. People sense when someone never owns mistakes. Conversations become guarded. Collaboration weakens. Over time, others stop offering feedback because it feels pointless. Why speak honestly to someone who will deflect, justify, or redirect the moment responsibility appears? The Stoics believed that character is revealed not in comfort, but in friction. When pressure exposes blame as a reflex, it signals immaturity, not intelligence. Taking responsibility does not mean carrying guilt for everything. Stoicism is not self-flagellation. It is precision. It means identifying the part you can influence and focusing there relentlessly. Even in situations where you were treated unfairly, there is still a question worth asking. How will I respond? That response is yours, always, and it is where your power lives. Intelligent people know this. They do not waste energy on resentment. They invest it in refinement. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when you stop blaming. You no longer need to protect an image. You become free to say, "I misjudged that. I reacted poorly. I should have prepared better." These statements do not weaken you. They clarify you. They turn experience into instruction. Over time, people begin to trust your words because they see alignment between reflection and action. You become predictable in the best sense, reliable, grounded. Blame also keeps people emotionally young. It preserves the mindset of a child waiting for the world to adjust. Responsibility matures the mind. It accepts that life is indifferent and that meaning is created through response. This is one of the core Stoic insights. You cannot control what happens, but you can control who you become in response to it. Blame delays that becoming. Responsibility accelerates it. If you notice the blame habit in yourself, the Stoics would advise starting small, not with grand confessions, but with private honesty. After a disappointment, write down what was within your control and what was not. Release the rest. Then act on the part that belongs to you. Over time, this practice rewires the mind. You stop looking for villains and start looking for leverage. That shift alone separates those who repeat the same year of life over and over from those who evolve. In the next part, we will examine a trait that often disguises itself as confidence, but actually prevents learning, damages relationships, and blinds people to their own limitations: arrogance, and why humility is not weakness, but strength refined. There is a thin line between confidence and arrogance, and many people cross it without realizing. Confidence is quiet. It does not need to announce itself. Arrogance, on the other hand, is noisy. It interrupts. It insists. It needs to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. The Stoics warned about this long ago, not because arrogance is offensive, but because it is dangerous to the one who carries it. Arrogance closes the mind at the exact moment it should be opening wider. An arrogant person often believes they are strong, decisive, and intelligent. In reality, they are fragile. Their sense of worth depends on being right, on appearing superior, on maintaining an image. That dependence creates fear. Fear of being questioned, fear of being corrected, fear of being exposed. So, instead of listening, they dominate. Instead of learning, they defend. And over time, their growth quietly stops. Marcus Aurelius wrote that it is impossible to learn what you already think you know. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is psychological truth. Learning requires humility, the willingness to say, "There may be something here I do not yet see." Arrogance refuses that possibility. It treats disagreement as disrespect and correction as an attack. The result is a shrinking world, one where feedback disappears and mistakes repeat themselves in different forms. You can recognize arrogance not by loud self-praise alone, but by subtle patterns. The person who constantly interrupts, the one who explains things no one asked about, the one who turns every conversation into a demonstration of their intelligence. They may believe they are leading, but they are actually pushing people away. Others stop offering ideas. They stop challenging assumptions, not because they agree, but because it feels unsafe or pointless to engage. Stoicism does not oppose confidence. In fact, it demands it. But Stoic confidence is rooted in character, not comparison. It does not require others to be smaller in order to feel tall. Seneca warned that arrogance is often ignorance with armor on. It protects the ego, but it also blocks insight. A person who cannot admit uncertainty cannot adapt, and a person who cannot adapt will eventually break when circumstances change. There is also a moral cost to arrogance. It diminishes empathy. When someone believes they are always right, they stop considering how their words land, how their actions affect others. They justify impatience as efficiency and dismissiveness as honesty. Over time, this erodes trust. People may comply, but they will not commit. They may listen, but they will not respect. Leadership built on arrogance is brittle. It holds until it doesn't. Humility, in the Stoic sense, is not self-doubt or weakness. It is accuracy. It is seeing yourself clearly, strengths and limitations included. A humble person can say, "I don't know," without shame. They can change their mind without feeling diminished. They can let someone else be right without feeling threatened. This flexibility is not softness, it is resilience. It allows a person to update their understanding as reality reveals more information. The truly intelligent person is not the one who speaks the most or asserts the hardest. It is the one who asks better questions, the one who listens for what they might be missing, the one who understands that being correct in the moment is less important than becoming wiser over time. Stoicism teaches that the goal is not to win arguments, but to live in accordance with truth. And truth is rarely owned by a single perspective. If you suspect arrogance in yourself, the Stoics would not advise self-criticism. They would advise observation. Notice when you feel the urge to interrupt. Notice the discomfort that arises when someone disagrees with you. Notice how quickly your mind prepares a rebuttal instead of curiosity. These moments are not failures, they are signals. Each one is an opportunity to choose humility instead of defense. Practice restraint in speech. Let others finish their thoughts. Ask questions you do not already know the answer to. Accept correction without explanation. These small disciplines weaken arrogance and strengthen clarity. Over time, something interesting happens. People begin to trust you more. They speak more openly. They offer better ideas, not because you became quieter, but because you became safer to engage with. Arrogance demands admiration. Humility earns respect. One inflates the ego, the other sharpens the mind. And in the long run, only one leads to wisdom. In the next part, we will explore a trait that often goes unnoticed, but quietly damages relationships and judgment alike: the lack of empathy, and why understanding others is not optional for a truly intelligent life. A lack of empathy is one of the clearest signs that intelligence has become shallow. A person may be sharp, articulate, even technically skilled, yet still fundamentally unwise if they cannot understand or consider the inner world of others. Stoicism never separated wisdom from humanity. To the Stoics, understanding people was not optional, it was essential. Without empathy, knowledge becomes cold and power becomes careless. Empathy is not about agreeing with everyone, it is about seeing clearly. It is the ability to recognize that other people carry invisible burdens, different contexts, different pressures. When empathy is absent, people interpret everything through a narrow lens. Delays become laziness, disagreement becomes disrespect, silence becomes incompetence. This distorted interpretation creates unnecessary conflict and quiet cruelty, often without intent. Many people who lack empathy do not see themselves as unkind. They see themselves as direct, honest, or efficient. They value results over feelings and believe emotions only get in the way. But Stoic philosophy never taught emotional denial. It taught emotional understanding and regulation. There is a difference. Ignoring emotion does not make it disappear. It only makes you blind to its influence, both in yourself and in others. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that people act from their understanding of what seems right to them. This perspective changes everything. When you realize that most behavior is driven by internal struggle rather than malice, your response shifts. You become less reactive and more deliberate. Without empathy, this shift never happens. You remain stuck in judgment, constantly offended, constantly frustrated that others do not behave as you expect. A lack of empathy also damages learning. Other people are mirrors. Their reactions, emotions, and resistance often contain information about reality that you cannot access alone. When someone shuts down around you, becomes defensive, or withdraws, empathy asks why. Arrogance or indifference simply labels them difficult and moves on. Wisdom pauses and reflects. Stoicism teaches that we are social beings by nature. We are not meant to live or grow in isolation. Seneca wrote that human beings are born for cooperation. Empathy is the mechanism that makes cooperation possible. Without it, relationships become transactional, rigid, and fragile. They break under pressure because there is no understanding to absorb tension. The danger of lacking empathy is not only external, it shapes how you treat yourself. People who cannot extend understanding outward often turn that same harshness inward. They judge their own struggles as weakness. They deny themselves patience. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion and quiet resentment, projected outward as criticism of others. Empathy, then, is not softness, it is balance. Developing empathy does not require dramatic gestures. It begins with attention, listening without planning a response, asking one more question instead of delivering one more opinion, pausing before assuming intent. These moments feel small, but they compound. They change the quality of your interactions and the accuracy of your judgments. Stoicism does not ask you to carry everyone's emotions. It asks you to acknowledge them. There is a difference. You can maintain boundaries while still recognizing that another person's experience is real to them. You can disagree without dismissing. You can correct without humiliating. These are not social skills alone. They are expressions of wisdom. A person without empathy often believes others are the problem. A Stoic understands that misunderstanding is the problem, and misunderstanding can be reduced through curiosity, patience, and restraint. When empathy is present, conflict becomes information instead of offense. Relationships become sources of insight instead of irritation. If you recognize moments in yourself where empathy is lacking, the Stoics would not condemn you. They would challenge you. They would ask you to remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you cannot see. That reminder alone softens judgment and sharpens perception. In the next part, we will examine another subtle but powerful sign of foolishness, the fear of change, and why resisting change is not stability, but slow decline disguised as comfort. Fear of change is often mistaken for prudence. People tell themselves they are being careful, realistic, or loyal to tradition. In truth, they are clinging to familiarity because it feels safe. Stoicism exposes this illusion clearly. What feels safe is not always what is wise. What feels stable is not always what is strong. Change is not the enemy of order. Resistance to change is often the enemy of growth. Those who fear change tend to build their identity around the way things have always been. Their routines, beliefs, and habits become extensions of who they think they are. Any suggestion of change feels like a personal threat, not an improvement. This is why they react defensively. It is not the new idea they reject. It is the discomfort of re-examining themselves. Stoic philosophy begins with one unshakable truth. Everything changes. Time moves. Circumstances shift. Bodies age. Roles evolve. To resist change is to argue with reality, and reality always wins. The Stoics did not seek to freeze life in place. They sought to move with it consciously, guided by reason rather than fear. Fear of change often hides behind phrases like, "This works well enough," or "There's no need to complicate things." But stagnation rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers. It convinces you that improvement is unnecessary, that effort is risky, that growth can wait. Meanwhile, opportunities pass quietly and potential goes unrealized. Consider how fear of change limits decision-making. A person stays in a role that no longer challenges them because learning something new feels overwhelming. They maintain relationships that drain them because starting over feels uncertain. They avoid difficult conversations because disruption feels dangerous. Each decision seems small, but together they form a life shaped by avoidance rather than intention. Stoicism teaches a different approach. You cannot control what changes, but you can control how you respond. Wisdom lies in preparing the mind to meet change without panic. This does not mean reckless action or blind optimism. It means flexibility grounded in values. You adapt without losing your principles. You move forward without abandoning yourself. Fear of change also reveals itself in language. People say, "I'm too old for that. That's just how I am," or "It's always been this way." These statements feel final, but they are self-imposed limitations. They close doors not because the doors are locked, but because opening them requires courage. Stoicism challenges this resignation. As long as you are alive, you are capable of growth. There is also a moral dimension to fear of change. When people refuse to adapt, others pay the cost. Teams stagnate. Families carry unresolved patterns. Institutions decay slowly while defending tradition. The Stoics understood that personal rigidity eventually becomes collective damage. Adaptation is not betrayal, it is responsibility. Change does not demand that you abandon everything. It asks that you examine what still serves virtue and what no longer does. A Stoic does not chase novelty for its own sake, but neither do they worship habit. They test beliefs against reality. They update strategies when circumstances change. They remain anchored to character, not comfort. Facing change begins internally. Notice the discomfort when something unfamiliar appears. Notice the stories you tell yourself to avoid engagement. Then ask a simple Stoic question: is this fear protecting me or limiting me? Often, fear pretends to be wisdom. Discernment reveals the difference. The paradox is this: those who embrace change thoughtfully experience more stability, not less. Because their stability comes from within, they trust their ability to respond, not their ability to control outcomes. They understand that clinging tightly to the past does not preserve it. It only delays the inevitable while increasing suffering. If you recognize fear of change in yourself, do not judge it, observe it. Then practice small acts of flexibility. Try one new approach. Listen to one unfamiliar perspective. Allow one routine to shift. These are not dramatic transformations. They are exercises in resilience. Over time, the fear loosens its grip. Stoicism does not promise comfort. It promises clarity, and clarity often requires change. The wise person does not ask how to keep life the same. They ask how to live well as life unfolds. In the final part, we will examine the last and most overlooked sign of foolishness, talking more than listening, and why silence is not emptiness, but the foundation of understanding and respect. Talking more than listening is one of the most common signs of foolishness, and also one of the most socially accepted. It often hides behind confidence, enthusiasm, or the desire to connect, but Stoic philosophy sees through this illusion quickly. Words are not proof of intelligence. In fact, excessive speech often reveals impatience, insecurity, or the need to control how others see us. A person who talks too much is rarely fully present. While others speak, their mind is busy preparing the next point, the next story, the next correction. They are not listening to understand. They are listening to reply. As a result, conversations become performances rather than exchanges. Information is lost. Emotional signals are missed. Opportunities for insight disappear quietly. The Stoics valued silence not as emptiness, but as discipline. Epictetus reminded his students that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listening is not passive. It requires restraint, attention, and humility. When you truly listen, you allow reality to speak before your ego does. That alone separates wisdom from impulsiveness. People who dominate conversations often believe they are adding value. In reality, they are reducing it. Others begin to withdraw, not because they have nothing to say, but because they feel there is no space. Over time, this pattern damages relationships. Family members feel unseen. Colleagues stop contributing. Friends grow distant. The talker remains unaware, mistaking silence from others as agreement rather than disengagement. Stoicism teaches that understanding precedes judgment. You cannot understand if you do not listen, and you cannot listen if you are always speaking. Marcus Aurelius practiced writing rather than speaking when emotions were strong, knowing that silence prevents regret. Speech, once released, cannot be taken back. Listening, however, always leaves room for correction. There is also power in measured speech. When someone speaks rarely but thoughtfully, their words carry weight. Others lean in. Attention sharpens. Silence creates contrast, and contrast creates meaning. The Stoics understood that restraint amplifies influence. You do not need many words when the few you choose are precise. Talking too much is often a defense against discomfort. Silence feels awkward. It leaves room for uncertainty. But Stoic wisdom asks us to sit with that discomfort rather than escape it. In silence, you notice more. You read expressions. You sense hesitation. You hear what is not being said. This awareness is unavailable to those who rush to fill every pause. Listening also refines character. It teaches patience. It weakens arrogance. It builds empathy. Over time, it changes how people experience you. You become someone others trust with their thoughts, not someone they need to compete with. This is not charisma. It is presence. And presence is the quiet authority of the wise. If you recognize this tendency in yourself, begin with restraint. Do not aim to speak less forever. Aim to speak later. Let others finish. Allow pauses. Ask clarifying questions instead of offering conclusions. These small practices rewire how you engage with the world. Stoicism does not teach withdrawal. It teaches proportion. Speak when your words serve truth, clarity, or virtue. Stay silent when they serve ego, habit, or impulse. Over time, this discipline transforms not only how others see you, but how you understand yourself. We have now walked through the 6 signs: a closed mind, constant blaming, arrogance, lack of empathy, fear of change, and excessive speech. None of these are permanent flaws. They are patterns, and patterns can be changed through awareness and practice. Stoicism is not about labeling people as foolish. It is about reducing foolishness in ourselves. Wisdom is not a destination. It is a direction. Every time you choose openness over rigidity, responsibility over blame, humility over arrogance, understanding over judgment, growth over comfort, and listening over noise, you take a step in that direction. The path is quiet. It does not announce itself, but over time, it shapes a life of clarity, strength, and respect. And that is the true mark of intelligence.